Welcome to Module 4 of the MELI Unit's Data Analysis and Reporting course. In this module, we will introduce you to key concepts of data visualization and reporting, including effective ways to present information to various stakeholder groups and tips for creating engaging visuals. Let's get started. Not all audiences need to receive information the same way. So what is the most effective way to present information to your various stakeholder groups? Of course, you need to start by identifying your stakeholders. Are you trying to reach your fellow program officers, senior leadership, policymakers, the general public? Each of these groups has different informational needs. Are your stakeholders making policy decisions, making operational decisions, or making program decisions? In MELI, we like to leverage something called layered reporting, which provides different forms of the same information to different stakeholders based on their informational needs. Level 1 is detailed reporting. This is for those stakeholders who need to engage with all data collected and see all relevant context behind the data. Level 2 is executive summaries. This is for stakeholders who need to see top-line information, with only the most important background context included. Traditionally, you might see this as a 5 to 10 page executive summary to a report, but you could also include data dashboards in this category. And level 3 is highlights. For this is for stakeholders who only need to see the most important data points and do not need the background context. This category can include any reporting that highlights specific pieces of information and are quick and easy to digest, such as one-pagers or infographics. And of course, data visualization is a huge component of making reporting accessible and easily understood to our stakeholders, regardless of whether they are visuals included in long-form reports or that we use in one-pagers or social media. So how do we ensure that our visuals are engaging for our stakeholders? There are a lot of tips and tricks we could cover, but in this module, we are going to cover 6. First up, you'll want to start by determining the narrative you want to tell through your visual. Crafting a narrative starts with analyzing your data to find both the similarities and differences within your data set. Certain elements will begin to stand out, and those will build the foundation of your narrative. In looking for those similarities and differences in your data, there are a number of relationships you can explore, but let's look at 3 of the most common ones you'll run into. The first is trends, which is when you look for consistent patterns between data points or data sets. For example, you might look at how program participation changes over time. There is also correlation, which is when we look for relationships within your data set. For example, we might look into whether students from particular economic backgrounds are more likely to participate in study abroad programs. And finally, our outliers, which is when we look for unusual or irregular occurrences within your data. For example, we might identify a country that sends an unusually high number of people to participate in a particular program. Second is to carefully consider your chart choice. Not all charts work in every context, and when choosing a chart, you need to think about the relationship within your data that you are trying to convey and choose a chart accordingly. Let's look at a couple of examples using the Financial Times Chart Chooser graphic. Ranking is one of the most commonly used categories of charts and are used when an item's position in an ordered list is more important than its absolute or relative value. In these cases, we often see the use of bar charts. But let's look at another common category, change over time. These are used to emphasize changing trends and are where you'll commonly see the use of line graphs. Third is designing your visuals in a way that doesn't distract from your data and the narrative you are trying to tell. One of the easiest ways to simplify your visuals is to remove the chart junk, which are the visual elements in charts and graphs that are not necessary to comprehend the information represented in the graph or that distract the viewer from its information. Some examples of chart junk that we want to remove from our visuals include distracting colors, pattern fills, grid lines, and the use of 3D. Let's look at an example. As you can see here, we start off with a very complicated graph and slowly but surely remove components so that it gets much simpler and easier to understand. We'll do things like remove the background, remove the special effects, remove some of the labels that aren't necessary, remove some of the lines. We've highlighted the main point. We'll even directly label. And so you can see we start off with something very complicated and end with something very simple. Fourth is designing graphics in a way that increases comprehension for your readers. Start by thinking about how you order the data in your visual. You can make comparisons easier by presenting the data in a logical order. Because our brains like patterns, sorting the data makes it easier to compare the values and identify trends and relationships. You can do this in a few ways. One is sorting the data from the lowest to highest values when what matters most is one category's value in relation to the others. But we can also sort alphabetically or sequentially if they are categories that should appear in a certain order for reader comprehension. But there are also exceptions to this rule. Response options like other, I don't know, or not applicable will generally appear last. But be mindful of how you order your data. To demonstrate, let's look at an example of participant education levels. Your instinct might be to order these data by value, as you would with most other categorical data. However, when you do so, you'll see that the categories appear in a somewhat confusing order. So how do we fix this? When we order by category, we are able to order the education levels in a way that is significantly more logical to our readers. We also want to use specific, detailed chart titles that tell our readers what they are looking at. For example, in this chart, we are directly calling attention to the fact that 52%, or half of our participants, are employed, and we do so by specifically saying so in the chart title that we provide. A few other things to consider. You'll want to make your chart title as concise but descriptive as possible. We want descriptive titles that tell our readers what they're looking at, but at the same time, we don't want our titles to be paragraphs long. There is a balance between the two to be found. You'll want to label your axes correctly and consistently. You should avoid using acronyms unless you know that they are going to be very commonly understood. And you'll want to try to label the Fifth is using color appropriately within your visuals. Color can be a valuable addition to your visuals, but it can be easily misused if you aren't careful. One way to use color is to direct the viewer's attention. For example, with this chart on participant employment, we might emphasize employed by using a different color, which helps direct the viewer to the point we are trying to emphasize, which is that half of participants are employed. Let's look at some other ways we can use color. One is to assign color along a scale. which we might do if we have sequential data from something like a frequency scale. We can also create contrasts between variables, which we might do if we have divergent data from something like an agree to disagree Likert scale. And lastly, we can distinguish between categories if we have categorical data, such as social media use. But a few cautions as you start bringing color into your visuals. The first is to ensure that you have proper foreground-background contrast. Remember that just because you can read the text doesn't mean that everyone else can, or will be able to on all mediums. There are a number of online tools that can help you check if you have a color contrast that meets ADA standards, and one that MELI particularly likes is webaim.org. In thinking about contrast, we also want to make sure that we avoid red-green color combinations, which cannot be distinguished by people with color blindness. Again, there are numerous online tools that can help check if you have a color contrast that meets ADA standards, and one MELI particularly likes is colorblindness.com. And lastly is number 6. Don't forget that graphs can be designed to be misleading to the reader. Let's look at 5 ways that graphs can be misleading. First is truncating the baseline. In most cases, the baseline for a graph is 0, but writers can skew how data are perceived by making the baseline a different number. This is known as a truncated graph. For example, in this graph, the vertical axis starts at 50, which makes a small difference between group A and the other groups appear much larger. However, if we start the vertical axis at 0, we have a much more accurate depiction of the data, with the difference between the groups not appearing as dramatic. Next is manipulating the y-axis. Expanding or compressing the scale on a graph can make changes in data seem more or less significant than they actually are. For example, the scale on this graph is disproportionate to the data, making the change over time seem quite small. Whereas, if the scale is more proportionate to the data, you see a more accurate representation of the change over time. Then we have cherry-picking data, which is when writers only include certain data points on their graphs to reinforce their narratives. This can create a false impression of the data. For example, this graph only uses a few months out of the year, which depicts an upward trend. However, when a much wider range of data is used, an overall downward trend is revealed. Next, we have using the wrong graph. As we discussed earlier in this module, the type of graph you use should depend on the type of data you want to visualize. Using the wrong graph can skew the data. Writers will sometimes purposefully use the wrong graph. For example, pie charts are used to compare parts of a whole, not the difference between groups. If we want to compare these 3 teams, we will want to use a different graph, like a bar chart, which is much better for showing differences between groups. And lastly is going against convention. Over time, we have developed standards for how data are visualized. Flipping those conventions can make a graph confusing or misleading to readers. For example, normally darker shades are associated with density on a map. But here, dark has been used to depict lower population density. This graph can confuse or mislead readers who expect dark to represent higher population density. Alternatively, when we follow the convention of using lighter shades for lower population density and darker shades for higher population density, readers will more intuitively know how to interpret the data. And that's it for our module on data visualization and reporting. When you're ready, you can head back to the training overview and take the course assessment.